Hello and welcome to our every now and then Bible study. Today I thought we could talk about something that I believe is very important to the entire spiritual community, not just to Christianity, but to the Jewish community, the Muslim community, the Sikhs, everyone. And this came about because of some things that were happening around here at Trinity today. The first is I ran across an article uh, of the New York Times doing a review about a Showtime documentary about Bill Cosby. And it was, or is, I have not watched it yet myself, but it was discussing the fact that, uh, especially in the African American community, they're having a tough time trying to decide what they're supposed to do. Obviously, he was America's dad, and he did all these wonderful things. He was a proponent for education. He actually has a doctorate of education himself, something he didn't need, he just wanted. And myself, I grew up with Bill Cosby being on PBS and Fat Albert and all these different positive aspects of Bill Cosby and what he did, does, and stood for. But then we also realize that he's just been released from prison because a Pennsylvania judge decided that the prosecutors cheated because they promised him that if he told the truth, they wouldn't prosecute. So he tells them what he did. He tells them that he gave quaaludes to women so that he could then have sex with them. And, it wasn't fair that uh, he never would have admitted to this had he known he could go to jail. It had to do with a civil lawsuit. And so we have these two things. And how do we handle this situation? Now, the other thing that happened today was in our preschool here at Trinity. One of the teachers was teaching about symmetry. And she was using a heart, trying to show them, here it is, a week before Valentine's Day. You can use a heart to teach about symmetry and how the human body is symmetrical. And so it has two sides. And that really got me to really thinking about these two things. Now, you may or may not know that the reason there are usually two candles on an altar in church. Now, some churches have sets of three or sets of seven. It really depends on your church and your setting. But generally speaking, on the actual altar, there are two candles. The reason there are two candles is because they represent the duality of humanity. They represent our physical side, and they also represent our spiritual side. There's the two sides, and those two sides are incredibly important. The fact that they are the yin and the yang of who we are, and they're both present. It's not one or the other. As a matter of fact, the one of the original heresies in the Christian church were the Gnostics. And the Gnostics believed in this duality, but they believed that you needed to somehow push down the physical part and raise up the spiritual part. And there were two groups of thought on this. The first group said, well, the only thing that matters is the spiritual, and they're actually separated. There's nothing you can do one way or the other. And so they become Epicurean in nature, and they just love life, and they eat all the food, and they have all the orgies, and they do everything they want because nothing they do physically has any aspect on their spiritual side. The other group of Gnostics believed the exact opposite. They believed that you had to starve one to feed the other. And so these folk actually would literally fast 4 or 5 times a week. They would beat themselves with ropes or even sometimes swords. They would flagellate themselves. They would do all these things to try to break down the physical body so as to raise the spiritual body. This is one of the first groups that Paul actually is writing about in his epistles. He's trying to put this aside and put it away. And so what we're dealing with is this duality of humanity. And how do we deal with this? We're having a big issue in our own society right now because we're trying to do either or. Either you have to be a Democrat or you have to be a Republican. Either you're a liberal or you're a conservative. And we use these words and we use these camps and we try to separate everybody into your district. Now, this is incredibly important right now also because most states are redesigning the election districts for the next 10 years. And there are, in every state, whether it is a Democrat ran state or a Republican ran state, they all gerrymander the system. They try to make it so that their guys all are in safe districts and they try to steal from the other guys. Proof in point, Nashville, as of today, is now for the first time ever going to be split up into multiple representative districts rather than having a representative of Nashville. The Republicans in Tennessee decided to separate that major city so as to make it more viable for there to be an actual Republican representative in one or all three of those districts rather than having a very strong stronghold. This happens every 10 years. We have the census and then we have the circus. And it's been happening ever since George Washington. It's just the way it is. But we have to understand that we have these examples. And as a matter of fact, Jesus is discussing this. And in our lectionary gospel reading this week, it's Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. And in our Old Testament lesson and in our Psalm, we have in Jeremiah, no, it's Isaiah. It's Isaiah. Isaiah is tearing down the situation. Nope, wrong again. Jeremiah. It was one or the other. We've been bouncing back and forth the last couple of weeks. But anyway, in Jeremiah, in the Old Testament lesson this week, which is actually Jeremiah 17:5 through 10, Jeremiah starts talking about what happens if you follow the wrong course, if you follow the wide and curvy way instead of the straight and narrow. We also have this in our Psalm of the week, which is Psalm 1. Now, Psalm 1 is a very fascinating psalm on many different avenues, not the least of which is that it is the prelude to the book of Psalms. In Psalm 150 is the postlude. Those two work literally as bookmarks for all the various books. Now there are 3 different books, or 5 different books rather, in the book of Psalms, depending on how you divide it up. And each psalm, there's a certain select number of psalms, and then at some point in time, an editor came and took all of them and created a book of Psalms. And if you go into the Apocrypha, there's actually a 151st Psalm. Psalms are also found throughout all of the Bible, whether you're talking Old Testament or New Testament. There are poems and songs throughout all of them, whether it be Moses' sister Miriam singing a song as they cross the Red Sea, or whether you look at the songs of Revelation. They're all there, and they all have their purpose, and they all have their place, and they all have their meaning. But Psalm 1 talks about how we are to be like trees planted by the stream, how we're not supposed to walk, stand, or sit with sinners, that we are supposed to be virtuous. Now let's look back at our original discussion. We were talking about Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby did some virtuous things. He did some incredible things. But he was also a predator. No way around it. He was a sexual predator toward women. He was both. He has both. There have been a number of issues coming up from various states right now, whether it be from Florida or Virginia or Texas or Mississippi. And we're having these issues and these discussions concerning race, concerning whether or not The people of today should feel bad or guilty about the things that happened in the past. And so we now have laws on the books in a couple of states that say you can't make white people feel guilty for slavery because it's mean, and you're discriminating against them, and you're doing these things. Well, that kind of sounds stupid, to be honest with you. It really does sound ridiculous to be having this conversation, and yet we are. And the reality is that there is a cancel culture right now. But if you say anything, or if you said anything 20 years ago, if someone can find it on the internet, and they can, it's going to be out there in front of everybody before it's said and done, and they're going to tear it down, and they are going to tear you down. And so you can have a misstep when you're in your 20s while you're at college, and it can destroy your professional career now. You can say something out of context today. Maybe you're trying to make a point, and so you use the extreme or the absurd to make your point. But while you're making your point, someone just takes that little snippet and says, see, this person is a ist of some kind, racist, sexist, whatever ist. And so they can take anything that you say and edit it and change it into saying something that you may not have ever intended. You may have actually been trying to make the exact opposite point. But if you take just little sections, all of a sudden you've been put in a category. Now both sides, left and right, are both doing this. And my point that I'm trying to make here is just like those candles on the altar, we do actually have the little angel and the little devil on our shoulders, constantly talking to us, constantly trying to get us to do one thing or the other. And it's how we listen to them and how we listen to our better angels or our greater demons that determines the mix in any of this. In many different forms of religion, whether it be the Buddhist or the Taoist or Christianity or Judaism or Muslim faith, we have these dualities that we recognize and we understand. And it is as we struggle with these dualities that we do have to understand that the Gnostics in some ways did have a point. Now I lean toward, if I'm going to be a Gnostic, which I'm not, but if I were to be a Gnostic, I would say that you would want to starve the physical to feed the spiritual. Because you can't be, you can try to be both for a while. You can be a hedonist and still try to, take care of orphanages and try to take care of the widows and try to take care of the poor, and you can do all that, and you can up to a point. But sooner or later, you're going to tip one way or the other. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in every day, each one of us. Not just Bill Cosby, but Reverend Kelly Shiflett. Not just President Trump, but also President Clinton. All of us are dealing with these struggles as we continue to fight with these things and as we continue to try to understand what Jesus is saying when he's saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. Woe to those who cheat the orphan. As we look at these blessings and woes, we have to struggle with what it means to be human. That, in the end, is what the entire journey to Jerusalem, which we're going to start in about a month when we have Ash Wednesday, the journey to Jerusalem is all based on this. How are we going to feed part of us and starve the other part? How are we going to recognize that we are both demon and angel? How can we overcome our greater demons so that we listen to our singing angels? In the weeks to come, hopefully we can have these conversations. If you have any thoughts on this, I'd love for you to leave comments. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to see if you have any topics that you might like to talk about. But right now, let's kind of explore this idea of good and evil. And let's try to just kind of wrap our minds around that as we prepare ourselves for our journey to Jerusalem for yet another year. I hope you have a good evening, and I'll talk to you later. God bless.